Hello, everyone. My name is Paul Buitink, and I have very much looked forward to this day to be having my old partner in crime, Tuur Demeester, back on, with whom I started this channel almost 7 years ago. Hi, Tuur.
Hey Paul, how's it going?
Fine. How are you?
Good.
How's life in Austin?
Doing great. The sun is shining.
Yeah. What about the economy there? Are you guys suffering a lot from the lockdown and from all the Corona measures?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think unemployment, the last number I saw was like 250,000 people lost their jobs. Of course, I mean, that goes very quickly because there's a bit of a gig economy and South by Southwest didn't happen. And so it's pretty tough. Like a lot of, it's kind of like a touristical place. Like of course, it's no Vegas, but it has that kind of like, there's always stuff happening. And now just people are traveling way less across state lines. So yeah, there's definitely, and it's starting to hurt. Like early March is when it started. So it's almost been 3 months now. Definitely, yeah, the economy is hurting. And it's just like everywhere else, everyone is levered up, like households, companies, governments. I think Texas is not in the worst shape of all the U.S. states. But yeah, I mean, it's kind of knock on wood, wait and see. And we're all, I guess you and I are both hoping for more like a slow crisis rather than the crack up boom. But I fear it's going to be that. I think they're going to keep propping everything up, and then eventually just the money is gonna start inflating.
Yeah, and maybe the crack boom is more painful, but then the recovery also can come soon
Yeah, that's true.
afterwards because
Yeah,
the
because
one that's spread out, yeah, it's probably in a way it's better, but it's also
is it even
um,
possible at this point, right? The muddle through, like really? I don't think so. I don't think they can credibly build off the debt burden. I don't think they can do that anymore.
no.
Especially now that the unemployment is so high. Like, what are you gonna do? Like,
Yeah, what's the unemployment rate in Texas?
I don't know Texas in particular. US wide, it's about 15% now. So yeah, it's interesting how I read a little bit about Europe. I'm curious what number you have from like, kind of Western Europe, but it seems like it's lower so far, but I wonder if that's maybe temporary because a lot of people or relatively more people are maybe, have fixed employment or employed by the government or something.
Yeah, for example, in Holland, the figure went up from 3.5 to 4%, which is still very low, of course, but it depends on how
Wow.
you measure that because a lot of hidden unemployment, of course. But
Yeah, yeah.
there's now 2 million people in Holland that work for companies that are being subsidized to keep them on the payroll. So once these subsidies end, of course, then you will see more unemployment rising fast. In a way, in the States, of course, it's more painful because people are out of job instantly, but it also forces them to retrain and to get back on their feet. I think in probably the recovery in the US will therefore be faster because in Europe they tend to muddle along much longer than in the States.
Yeah, I hope so. I mean, I'm sure you and I agree that you know, the capital structure of the economy is massively flawed because it's built on this idea, this illusion that, debt is free and we can always find a job. And so people have been spending way beyond their means. And I remember actually on Twitter recently, somebody was like, oh, you don't want to, too many people have been living beyond your means. And someone was like, what is your definition of that? And it's like, well, almost like the moment you have debt, you may already be there because your income is uncertain. Um, and so what we need is like, we need for the economy to restructure and so that it's in line with the capital that's actually there. And people need to stop living beyond their means. And that means that a lot of businesses need to reorient. Like we probably need more, whatever, maybe like cheaper food rather than high end expensive food and less hotels. And it's kind of hard to say. It's like we just need less luxury economy and more basics so that the price of the basics can be kind of more, you know in sync with what the economy needs.
Yeah, it's time for readjustment, and it's also time, of course, high time for a better monetary system. And in a way, I'm a bit surprised that Bitcoin has not profited so much from this severe crisis. If you look at price or adoption or use, or do you see that differently?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's still very much that, in a way, it's weird. The Bitcoin cycle has been very kind of stubborn and has been just doing its thing, and it's not immediately reacting to global macro stuff. Although we are seeing activity pick up in Africa and Latin America. But I think it's still the twilight zone. I think a lot of people are still in denial that in a way, it's the perfect excuse. We have a pandemic, boom, like unemployment. Oh, it's caused by the pandemic. Therefore, the moment we have a vaccine, like we're back online, it's going to be the way it was, or almost the way it was. And that's just, it's like a mirage. I think a lot of people just think that we're going to go back to normal somehow, in the sense at least that, you know, the banks are going to keep working the way they did. The money is going to keep its value. Governments are going to keep paying unemployment. Pension funds are going to keep paying. Like all these assumptions, I think a lot of people just still have that. And that's why they're not fleeing into an asset like Bitcoin or even gold. I mean, there's more demand for gold than 2-3 years ago, but it's still not a melt up, right?
No, exactly. I've been through many crises now, and I remember every time, for example, back in 28, I expected gold to rise a lot. Eventually it happened. But in 2013, that was funny because I was in Cyprus together with Michai Alisi, one of the founders of Ethereum, to shoot a documentary around the time of the crisis there. And that was for me such a clear confirmation of that we need something like Bitcoin that people can hold without governments being able to confiscate it or being able to restrict usage. And then, of course, we saw a big rise up. And later on, I read it probably was not completely related to Cyprus, but at least there was correlation. We had a crisis in Cyprus and we saw a Bitcoin picking up. In 2015, we had Greece, also people not being able to access their bank accounts. Another very clear sign that you need something like apolitical money, something like Bitcoin, to protect people's savings and people's access to the financial system. But now we have this massive crisis, and I just, when I look around, talk to normal people, of course, no disrespect there, but I don't see the same interest in Bitcoin as we saw in 2017 when we had the huge run-up. And that was, of course, not related to any crisis. That was just, in a way, mass hysteria to a certain extent. And a lot of people, of course, stayed in Bitcoin afterwards, but also a lot of people got discouraged because of the crash. And also, yeah, if you look at the trends, Google Trends by Bitcoin, it hasn't really been growing compared to 2017.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, so basically 2017, we live in a bubble world. Like there's so many bubbles. There's a VC bubble, there's like a tech bubble in a way. There's a stock market bubble. There's a bond market bubble, housing bubble. And so it was just another exponent, another bubble. It was like a greed-driven rally that we saw. That's why all these altcoins also went nuts. I mean, I was looking at, just to give an example, and there's just so many hundreds of examples, but like the Civic token, the Vinny Lingham's token, it peaked at $400 million market cap, and now it's 15, like 2 years later. So, it was just completely nuts. And I think a lot of common people saw that and identified it correctly as a greed-driven thing. And so it's kind of counterintuitive for them that like all of a sudden now Bitcoin is a safe haven, whereas before it was like, crazy tulips. So I think that we need to kind of get rid of that skepticism a bit more. And I think that once the price goes beyond 20,000 again, that's when retail is going to pile in. Right now it's institutions, family offices that are basically buying still the dip after that big rally of 2017. So I'm not worried. I think eventually, people are going to catch on that you can buy gold, but if you want to send something across borders, there's just nothing that beats Bitcoin. It's just amazing how powerful it is, peer-to-peer, open source. So yeah, I'm not surprised that people are not seeing the light and all flocking to Bitcoin. Although I do think that it's actually more scarce now with the halving behind us. And so I do think that supply is drying up and we are going to see a rally in 2020.
Yeah, because a lot of people were expecting a huge price rise because or after the halving, and that hasn't yet happened. Of course, it's early days, and since if you've been long enough in Bitcoin, you've seen so many cycles that one cycle doesn't really bother you too much. But I guess maybe it's also a little bit of fatigue with myself. I don't know if you experienced that too. Like if you've been in Bitcoin for so long, at some point it becomes a bit stale, maybe, or something like you start to. Me, for example, I used to be following it on a very daily basis. Also, when we had our show in Dutch in 7 years ago. And maybe it's just a personal interest thing, but at some point I just started to lose track a bit of what was going on, because I was, of course, life got in the way. You get a child, you get other things, job, all these things. Difficult to then following it on a very detailed basis, and also to find motivation to do so. Are you tweeting now, for example, less about Bitcoin than a few years ago? Are you now also spreading your interest a bit more, or are you still very much dedicated to Bitcoin most of your time?
It's kind of like, to some extent I can't help myself, but I think
addiction
that,
almost.
yeah, I mean, it's just I just care about it, and so that's why I keep like commenting on it against my better judgment sometimes. But also I sympathize. Like, there's a lot more noise than there was 7 years ago. There's just so much more like kind of personal attacks happening. Like, it's just more people involved, and the kind of the standard of communication has lowered. I have like hundreds and hundreds of people that I've blocked over the years on Twitter, and it's just something you have to do. Like, you have to like kind of to stay sane, to have this rigorous hygiene policy. But I don't imagine I'll be kind of full-time writing about Bitcoin forever. Like, I'm definitely working on some other projects, and it's also, I feel like it's a little bit like the value that I can add is lowering a bit. I feel like it's kind of like coming into its own. The network is really, I think, kind of robust against attacks. Like, there'll be a few more attacks, but I think that it's in good hands. And also my personality is I kind of, I like to support things that are really in the fringe and that are kind of universally hated. And Bitcoin is not universally hated anymore. Like, there's a lot, like there's thousands and thousands of people that love it and they're so passionate about it, and it's great. But so I feel like I can maybe make more of a difference in some other areas then.
Yeah. No, I see your point. And how many people you think at the moment worldwide either hodl Bitcoin or use it or are interested in it? Do you have any estimate?
I mean, my best bet is anywhere between 10 and 50 million, 10 to 50, something like that. But that's just really
in Holland at some point 2 years ago, around 3 to 4% of people either they own Bitcoin. Of course, Holland is not a proxy for the rest of the world, but I would think like 1% possibly of world population. So that would be around 17 million, but maybe that's on the high end then.
I mean, yeah, I think some people lost interest and they left. So I think it's probably lowered since 2 years ago. But yeah, I mean, it could be between 20 and 100 million. Like, I really can't tell. It's kind of the beauty of Bitcoin that we just don't know. And also, like, there's more and more on distinction whether between owning and not owning is going to become more fuzzy. Like, if your pension fund has Bitcoin, like, do you own it or not? Like, you kind of do, but then you don't really. It's a matter of debate.
Are there pension funds currently owning Bitcoin?
No, but they will. No, because it's like the same with the insurance sector. Like, they're the most conservative, the most regulated. They're just, they're swimming in their ocean of government bonds for the moment. So yeah,
so they also have an incentive to prop up the current system, and in that sense, if they start diversifying or giving signals that Plan A is not going to have a good ending, and they're aiming for Plan B, then of course that could set off a whole chain reaction that the regulators, of course, are never going to accept.
Yeah, and it's also, they've been like dancing with the devil for so long, because pension funds in particular, usually they strike some kind of, not that they're evil or anything, but they strike some kind of deal with the government that says, you are going to be in a category where your investors, quote unquote, or whoever has their pension with you are going to pay less taxes on that than with a regular hedge fund or something. And then the deal is always that, well, you kind of have to buy our debt, right? And so they buy a lot of government debt, and so they end up being really bloated, and their performance isn't good. So they're kind of like semi-nationalized institutions, and so politically it's very tricky. We've seen that in Holland, even though there are really like private pension funds, but when they had like too much gold, then all of a
Yeah,
sudden that
famous.
was a
Yeah.
problem, and it's like that everywhere, I think.
And what is your best adoption metric that you follow to understand if Bitcoin is gaining traction amongst people? You have price, of course, but that's I don't think that's the best proxy personally. But then you have users, which is difficult to measure. Volatility, that's not going really down, a little bit maybe over time, but they're still very volatile days. What is your ideal metric to follow, or a combination of metrics?
I mean, I would say that the best is probably, it's by proxy, obviously, and it's not even to identify a particular number, but looking at how many and which kind of companies are integrating with Bitcoin. So like, for example, now we've seen JP Morgan open their own Bitcoin desk, and institutions can go there and buy Bitcoin, get exposure that way. Like Cash App, of course, is massive. You know, Twitter is probably going to integrate with Bitcoin. Like all of that to me is way, you know, really, who cares how many individuals have it? Like, I mean, of course, no, we care. Fundamentally, we care. But I feel like these companies, they want to serve their customers. Like, you know, Fidelity has 17 million customers. And so the fact that they're opening up for Bitcoin, it means that they think their customers, to the extent that they don't yet, they will care, and they should care. And
Yeah, that's important. Yeah, remember
so
back
that's,
in
and the amount of like the e-commerce interest has waned, which I think was appropriate because there wasn't any real payment rails online yet. That's going to come back, but I think it's encouraging that the kind of the asset managers, that they've been really interested in Bitcoin.
Yeah, because back in the day we used to celebrate whenever a merchant started to accept Bitcoin with Microsoft, and in Holland we had this delivery service, Thuisbezorgd, and hardly anyone used it, but still we were very much celebrated that, because and it was a bit naive maybe, but back in the day, of course, transaction costs were very small, so it was cool to use as a payment. I've used Bitcoin on many occasions to buy for something. Of course, with hindsight, you sort of regret it, but it was fun, you know. In that way, you could enthusiast people to use it. But now it's more about, like you said, it's much more interesting when a asset manager is going to accept it, or when a big brokerage firm is going to add it to their portfolio. That's much more interesting at the moment.
Because also, like in the evolution of money, like store of value, well, collectible and then store of value comes before medium of exchange. So in a way, you focusing on Bitcoin as payments is kind of putting the cart before the horse.
Yeah, but we all did it in the first few years. But it was fun also to be able to do it internationally, to pay with your phone.
It proved the point.
Yeah. And so like Twitter is a very good example. Jack Dorsey, the CEO founder with millions of followers, only has Bitcoin in his bio, just as Bitcoin. So he is very much into it, also celebrating Pizza Day. And so it's one of our, I think, one of the best cheerleaders almost that you can imagine. But his company Stripe stopped accepting Bitcoin 2 years ago because it was just not very easy to use as a payment because of volatility and throughput and transaction costs. You think Jack is working on something in order to reintegrate Bitcoin into his services, or maybe to use Lightning, I must say, because Lightning has also been around for a few years and it's not really, I don't see it anywhere. I can't pay for my groceries yet with the Lightning network. So is he going to use maybe Lightning?
I think so. I mean, he personally invested in a Lightning-focused startup, and not to say that, you know, he has a plan. I think it's more like that. It shows where his mind is at, and also they are involved with Bitcoin core development. Like they're very seriously focused on building the Bitcoin stack, and then also integrating. Like that was this maybe like 4 months ago or something. There was a press release that, I mean, initially the idea of Twitter was actually to build a decentralized social media platform, and then that wasn't feasible at the time, and so they just built Twitter the way it is. but they're really sympathetic still to that idea. And so they are seeing in the Lightning stack, especially in the Lightning protocol, some promise for integrating that with social media and like allowing people to spread messages around the world in a kind of a decentralized way. And obviously that means payments can be bundled in with media and messages, and you can imagine micro payments for an article or things like that. So I think they're very much involved, and I think, you know, just Stripe stopping to accept is just a way to, you know, it costs money to accept something and to support something technically that nobody's using. So you just plug it out until it's ready to go back online. So I don't think it's very surprising that that happened.
Yeah, it's in the end, it's all a matter of patience, and that's also something I appreciate about Bitcoin and its community. That, you know, there's no hurry. Of course, it would be nice if during a big crisis like the one we are in at the moment, that there would be a full alternative available. But at the same time, it's more important not to be rushed into a half solution, and it's better just take your time and make sure that what you build is good to use. And so I guess speed is not always in your favor. Sometimes it's good to keep a slow pace, but be very strong with what you do and make sure it's very something you can trust, something you can rely on.
Yeah, Bitcoin is like, they're like the life rafts on the Titanic. Like, you want to make sure that they don't sink. Like, whether they have a big engine, it's not so important. Like, you want to make sure that it's robust. And right now, there's a lot of empty seats left. Like, the amount of value that Bitcoin could absorb is, even at the current, you know, stage of infrastructure, is massive. Like, we could do 10x, 100x, and Bitcoin could still support it.
And what is the biggest threat you think to Bitcoin? Like, what's the attack factor that you sometimes worry about? Regulation?
I think more the culture, because there's always going to be attacks. But if the culture is kind of slacking and people don't really care if there's a hard fork and how it's done, or how the code is potentially changed, and they just mindlessly upgrade and they basically invite code that is malicious, that is very, very tricky. That's dangerous. So, you know, it would be wrong if there's ever a successful attack on Bitcoin to say like, oh, well, this attacker was so smart. I think it will be a sign that it's the kind of cultural aspect that has failed in keeping Bitcoin safe and vigilant. Because I think Pierre Rochard said it recently. Someone asked like, well, you know, what if someone, what was it again? I forget, but it's basically he was pointing out that if something goes wrong with Bitcoin, we can always just revert to the last solidly working version of Bitcoin, because it's this iteration. It's like an evolutionary process. And if we get a mutation that is very bad for everyone, we can just revert back to the previous version and kind of think over and do it again. And that's why this emphasis on the economically important nodes is so valuable. Like, people always think like, oh, the miners control Bitcoin. But really, if you think of it, you and I, we choose which version of the software we run on our computer in order to broadcast our transactions. And so the people that have the most economic value invested in Bitcoin, they're the ones responsible for making sure that it's, you know, the good software that is run, the most decentralized and robust software.
Yeah, and the number of nodes is going down. Is that something that worries you, or is that a sign of culture in decay to a certain extent? Or?
Well, I mean, I don't know. I mean, I'm still seeing, like, if I look at Luke Jr.'s stats, like 43,000 nodes, full nodes live. I think that's plenty. Obviously, we want 100,000 or more. But I mean, eventually, it's a kind of a corporate infrastructure. Over time, less and less people will use the blockchain directly, just because it'll be expensive for one transaction. It could be $100 or $1,000 per transaction. But it is going to be vital, kind of underlying infrastructure, and companies are going to run nodes for sure. So I would like to see that number stay, you know, above 10,000 for sure. And that's why it's important that the software is lightweight, that basically, at least in theory, that you can run it on your smartphone.
And how do you see this development among central banks to come up with their own digital currency? In China, they've now started piloting their own digital yuan. They even give civil servants as a pilot in a certain region part of their salary in this digital coin. Of course, China feels the threat of Libra and wants to make sure that they are the first to launch this coin, because then they can also try to promote it and make it bigger. And of course, they want the dollar not to be the reserve standard anymore. So they're using possibly this new digital currency as a way to leapfrog the dollar, or at least to gain in importance versus dollar. Do you believe these developments, they pose a threat to Bitcoin, or do you believe it will only make Bitcoin bigger because people then get used to using these types of wallets with digital coins, and that may make them more interested in the decentral alternative out there?
To me, this just confirms my hypothesis that, you know, what we're seeing is a Reformation 2.0, and it's this big societal development where we transition from monetary monopolism to monetary freedom, because I think that's ultimately what the Protestant Reformation was about. It wasn't so much about Protestantism, it was more that religious freedom became kind of a common thing, first in the New World and then across the world. And so the Counter-Reformation was the Catholic Church trying to come up with answers to all these rebels, and they had new doctrines to some extent and new you know, schools of thought and things like that. But in the end, it was all futile. It didn't really make a difference. Sometimes it distracted people for a while, or local kings would adopt it. And so similarly here, I mean, yeah, they're trying some things. If anything, it's validating for Bitcoin, because it shows that they are recognizing Bitcoin as a formidable opponent, as something that needs an answer, that needs to be acted. So in a way, them being reactionary is to some extent revealing their weakness. It's like, you know, if you needed to do that digital yuan or whatever, if that was so important, why didn't you do it 10 years ago? Like, we've been, you know, so why now? But in the end, I don't even think it'll be that different. If anything, they're going to try more surveillance, maybe. Like, they're never going to make an anonymous, decentralized coin, like, that's for sure. So whatever it's going to be, it's a variation on something they're already doing.
Yeah, especially in China, they're not going to allow for anonymity in that coin. In Holland, for example, they're discussing within the central bank to maybe allow for if we come up with a digital coin in the Eurozone as well, that you would allow people to do small amounts still on an anonymous basis. I don't think in the end they will implement that. I think they will just seize the opportunity to go full surveillance. But you know, what sometimes bothers me here in Europe, and especially in the Netherlands, is that they are trying to impose onerous regulation on crypto companies. And in Holland, we have now implemented a new directive from the European Union, the Anti-Money Laundering Directive 4, the AMLD4, but in a more restrictive way. And the result is that as a crypto company, if you offer exchange or wallet services, you have to pay around 20,000 euros at least for regulation costs. So even if you're just one person with your own site and offering some services, wallet services, whatever, then you have to pay that amount already, and you have to implement all sorts of measures. You have to start tracking KYC, all the other things that banks have to do as well. So that's almost impossible, of course, to comply to. So people or companies are actually leaving Holland, which makes the amount of companies left smaller, but they still have to carry the total regulatory burden per year. So the costs per company are only going up, basically making sure that all crypto innovation in Holland is going to be destroyed. And of course, they can do that in other countries as well. And that's still a bit my big worry, that they will not let Bitcoin become too big, because if it becomes a big threat, they will just regulate it out of existence. Of course, it will still be there, but if you cannot use it because every shop, every exchange service needs to be regulated in order to accept it, it becomes less attractive to use, of course.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of It's going to be a new world order where like some countries are going to be very unfriendly, and in a way, the countries that are most invested in the existing financial system are probably going to be the ones that are the most unfriendly. But there's whatever, like at least 200 countries in the world or something. Um, so there, especially as the value of the industry increases, there's going to be countries that are like, sure, you want to build an exchange, do it here, and then you service clients, overseas or whatever. And also like, I think we have to keep in mind that right now the cost of the status quo is not very high. Like if you are, you have your wealth in euro, or you do business in euros or in dollars, like it's kind of business as usual. But as inflation ramps up and as we see more capital controls and more kind of chaos, then the cost of the status quo is going to raise significantly. And so the willingness for just, regular people to do something that is like maybe a little bit illegal or like in the gray zone, their willingness goes up a lot. It's like in Argentina, like everybody's just involved in the gray economy because there's this hyperinflation of regulation that in the end, everyone is like rolling their eyes. Like you cannot even enforce it. Like the government doesn't have money to enforce all the gazillions of rules. So it's this weird, laissez-faire, de facto laissez-faire economy that then emerges. So
yeah, we have the same here in Europe, of course, now with all these lockdown measures that I cannot possibly enforce on people. So you see already back when hairdressers were still closed, you would see people starting or doing dressings, cutting people hair in the evening in some garage or at home. A lot of people were trying to avoid these rules, and more rules there are, the more attractive it becomes for people to avoid them. And yeah, something like that could also play out in a monetary sphere, of course.
yeah, that's my best bet as to, of course, you for bigger companies, they're going to have to find an actual safe haven. But I'm sure there's going to be countries that are going to receive them with open arms, especially maybe countries that have, like an Iceland or something. They just have so much energy. They will always remain invested in mining because it's just so attractive to convert energy directly into money. So I think some other economies that happen to have a lot of oil or things like that, they're going to try and um, why wouldn't they be friendly to also kind of Bitcoin payments companies?
Yeah. And a final question from my end, because that's of course currently one of the most important debates, whether we're going to have deflation or hyperinflation or N, so maybe first deflation, then inflation. There's so many different opinions. If you now look at, for example, Hertz filing for bankruptcy, selling all these cars, you can buy a Hertz car far below market value. So at first, there's deflation everywhere I look. But also there's already inflation in other categories. But how's this going to play out in your view? This whole deflation, inflation dynamics. What are we going to see first, when, where, and how will it transform over time?
Yeah, well, I think it's one of the big fallacies of our time that like inflation, or the value of money is some kind of homogenous thing that like, and then we can just have one measuring stick to like decide whether the money is increasing in value or decreasing in value. And because the reality is it's heterogeneous and it depends on who's spending and what they're spending on. That really makes the value of money. So for example, luxury goods right now are deflating heavily. Like like you were saying, if you want to buy a car, it's going to be cheaper than it was last year. If you want to buy some piece of technology, it'll probably be cheaper. If you want to stay in an Airbnb, I think even in Amsterdam, you could do it for like 20 euros nowadays a night. The same here. So there's deflation there, but that's just because the demand is down. Demand is down for those services. And then on the other hand, for like, obviously face masks or kind of certain medical products or just basic foods, there all of a sudden the price goes up. So that's inflation. And so to me, that's what matters. Like you want to look at the essential expenses for people and look if that's going up. And of course it is. I mean, even in the US for the past 5 years, we're seeing 10% annual inflation easy. If you look at just cost of living, just in a normal city, cost of living has measurably gone up 10% every year, even though official inflation has been between like 2 and 3%, I think. So you have to look at the real world to identify inflation. I think we're going to go to high inflation. Hyperinflation has a very specific definition. It's like 50% of inflation every month at least, for a certain amount of time. So it's kind of like, you only need the money to decline by 50% 4 times in a row, and you're already down more than 80%. So I don't really care if it's going to be called hyperinflation or not. There's going to be massive devaluations happening throughout the world. And it's going to be incredibly disruptive for economies because it's the blood of the economy. Literally, money is the blood of the economy. It's what transports, it's what communicates with it, allows for communication. And so when the money breaks down, the communication breaks down. And it's going to be tough, but it's necessary because we need to get rid of all this debt. It's like we're buried under a Himalaya of debt, and it needs to evaporate.
And do you think a debt jubilee would be a good thing then for especially consumers with too much debt?
Yeah, there's no other way. I mean, I kind of hate it because, the biggest debtors are the governments and the banks, but, individuals who works at governments or banks are never held personally liable anyway. So I think that we need to get rid of this debt burden because ultimately it's the individual who pays the price. Paul Krugman says, debt is money we owe to ourselves. It's like, no. The interest on the debt is paid by the taxpayer, right? I mean, there's somebody paying at the end of the line, and it's not everybody paying the same amount. So if we can get rid of the debt, we can also get rid of that tax burden. But yeah, it'll be rough.
Well, Tuur, thanks a lot for your thoughts. Any other things you want to add or things you want to say?
And people always wonder what to do. What do you do? And then to me, I feel like the word of the decade is going to be optionality. Is just that's what I try and do. Is try to keep your options open, keep your eyes peeled, kind of follow the news, and also just take care of yourself and your family first. Because that's a lesson that I need to heed. Is sometimes I get lost and there's just always more news coming out and more to learn. But ultimately,
information overflow is a big risk. And the optionality, like you say, or anti-fragility, like Taleb would label it, be sure to learn different skills and to have options in life.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Okay, Tuur, thanks a lot and good luck there in Austin and stay safe.
Thanks. See you.